natural gas to transform the country. In a short span of time, Canada's energy use radically changed as the country transitioned to a high-energy fossil fuel-based economy in the years after the Second World War. Fossil fuel consumption accelerated at a rapid rate, altering nearly all aspects of everyday life in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. From the way people worked and played to the way they ate and slept, life in Canada changed in the new high-energy economy. Fossil fuels powered Canada's transition to the Anthropocene. Oil played a central role in this history, and pipelines made this possible. My presentation today focuses on the regulation of long-distance oil pipelines in Canada, specifically how governments approved their initial construction and operation. In some ways, this part of my broader research project on the history of the social and environmental consequences of oil pipeline development in Canada is meant to provide more nuance and complexity to our understanding of Canada's transition to high-energy fossil fuels in the second half of the 20th century than headlines like this suggest. This was an article based on an interview that I gave to National Post back in 2018. And the headline, I think, is a little bit of an oversimplification of what was a more complicated process, but it does capture some of the points that I tried to make in that interview. What I hope to do today is provide you with a little more detail and understanding of what went into the regulatory approvals processes for the first two major long-distance oil pipelines in Canada after 1947. Canadians' insatiable appetite for oil was enabled and fed in part by the enormous reserves of crude oil that Imperial Oil first discovered outside of Edmonton, Alberta at Leduc in 1947. The country also relied on imports of oil from abroad, mainly from the United States, Venezuela, and the Middle East. Canada's first wave of post-war oil production lasted from 1947 until the early 1980s, when Alberta reached a peak of conventional oil output in 1980 at 63.2 billion liters. Not long after the Leduc strike in 47, new pipeline corporations began to send a flurry of proposals and requests to the federal government for corporate charters and licenses to begin construction of major long-distance oil pipelines, the largest that would have been built in the country to that point. The federal government, then as today, was responsible for regulating pipelines that cross interprovincial and international borders. And so in response to the sudden interest in pipeline construction, the Canadian government passed the Pipelines Act in 1949 to try to begin to regulate this emerging industry. Later that year, the Interprovincial Pipeline Company, now Enbridge Incorporated, began construction of what would become one of the longest oil pipeline systems in the world, the Interprovincial Pipeline, which which travels 3,700 kilometers from Edmonton to Montreal, so west to east, passing through the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, and the U.S. states of Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and New York. A second major pipeline project started shortly thereafter, connecting Edmonton to Burnaby, British Columbia in 1953 with a spur line to refineries in the state of Washington. The Trans Mountain Pipeline crosses the Rocky Mountains at Yellowhead Pass and travels roughly 1,155 kilometers to the Pacific Ocean. So combined, these two pipelines account for the largest volume of crude oil shipments across provincial and international borders for most of the second half of the 20th century, and remain as a critical backbone to the flow of domestic oil in Canada today. So in 1949, the new Pipelines Act designated the Board of Transport Commissioners responsible for licensing oil and gas pipelines that crossed international and interprovincial borders in Canada. The board held this responsibility just for about a decade until 1959, when the Pipelines Act was replaced by the National Energy Board Act, which created a new regulatory body, the National Energy Board. Previously, the Board of Transport Commissioners was known as the Board of Railway Commissioners, and it was primarily concerned with regulating railway tariffs and freight rates. Even after it assumed responsibility for oil and gas pipelines, its work remained focused mainly on railway matters, more so than energy infrastructure regulation. And one piece I found really interesting is in their first hearing for the interprovincial pipeline company's first segment of its pipeline, the chief commissioner had to ask for an explanation of what a pump station was on a pipeline, which I thought was a bit of an indication of the degree to which the board was out of its depth in terms of regulating energy pipelines, something they had no role in before 1949. The Act made the Board of Transport Commissioners responsible for reviewing and approving proposals for new pipeline construction, and it granted the board a range of quasi-judicial powers to inspect pipelines and review the operation of pipeline companies. This included powers to regulate conditions for the production and protection and safety of the public, although I've yet to find any documentation of Board of Transport Commissioner investigations into safety on oil and gas pipelines during that 10-year period that they were responsible. So to try to understand then how the Board of Transport Commissioners approach the regulation of the first long-distance oil pipelines in Canada, I've been reviewing and analyzing the published decisions of the board relating to applications for pipeline construction, as well as the transcripts of the hearings that the board held into these applications for licenses to build long-distance pipelines. And specifically, I'll be speaking about the first hearings for the interprovincial pipeline and the Trans Mountain pipeline in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. Pipeline hearings are useful moments for studying the interactions of state regulators, governments, private corporations, and private citizens, because they were a forum for a variety of interests where different parties presented evidence and arguments in an effort to shape the development of energy infrastructure. They can be sites of conflict as differing interests clashed over questions of economic development, safety, environmental protection, property rights, indigenous rights, and more. In my examination of the earliest regulatory approvals for pipelines, I've been able to reconstruct the various interests at play in these first pipeline debates to understand how regulators evaluated and eventually approved proposals to build energy infrastructure that would come to reshape the Canadian economy and environment in the second half of the 20th century. These hearings weren't always forum for citizen participation, and the issues that did emerge didn't necessarily include the same type of concerns about safety, environmental protection, and indigenous rights that we might expect to hear today. But while the pipeline politics of today might not be recognizable in these mid-century hearings, these hearings nevertheless had their own politics. In evaluating pipeline proposals, the Board of Transport Commissioners was primarily concerned with the following issues. So first, the board spent much of its evaluation of applications for licenses to build pipelines on trying to understand the financing of the pipeline, including requesting documentation like statements from any creditors and investors and testimony from company principals. Second, the board was concerned with the market viability of pipelines. So they scrutinized the assessments of production potential in the oil fields in Alberta, as well as the capacities of the refineries where the pipelines were going to be delivering the oil, and the prospects of the consumer markets in the mostly urban areas where the oil was being delivered. Third, there were a number of considerations I've kind of grouped as economic nationalist considerations that shaped the debates over pipelines in these early hearings. Debates over the economic interests of Canada were prominent concerns raised by interveners and the commissioners themselves, and I'll highlight a couple of those examples with these two pipelines in a moment. And then finally, the board was concerned, at least modestly, with safety and environmental considerations. Though these weren't a significant component of the hearings, there were a couple of occasions during which commissioners and interveners raised issues relating to safety and environmental protection, particularly concerning inland waterways and the risk of oil spills. Now, these pipeline hearings, as I said, were quite different than what regulatory hearings for pipelines look like today, and there were notable omissions in terms of issues that were raised in these hearings. The first, which surprised me quite a bit, was that there was very little discussion of property rights on the right-of-way. There were a few brief remarks about providing compensation to farmers whose land would be bisected by these proposed pipelines, but more often the discussion around property rights focused almost exclusively on railway crossings, which I think is a reflection of the legacy of the Board of Transport Commissioners' responsibility for regulating railways in the country. The other omission was any discussion of Indigenous land rights, which again is surprising considering that the Pipelines Act prohibited the board from approving any encroachments on Indian reserves without the consent of the Governor and Council, the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And in at least the case of the interprovincial pipeline extension to Sarnia, it did cross into the reserve lands of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation at the Sarnia Indian Reserve, which didn't emerge in these hearing discussions, though this did become an issue outside the context of the regulatory hearings. And then lastly, there was largely no discussion of broader environmental concerns, no discussion about air pollution, impacts on wildlife, construction disturbances, fire risks, and zero discussion about climate change. And again, those are issues that would become more prominent later in the 20th century and certainly in the present. So I'll begin by sharing what I've found in the case of the interprovincial pipeline. In June of 1949, the Interprovincial Pipeline Company had its first regulatory hearing in Ottawa, which was held here at the Union Station building in 1949, before the Board of Transport Commissioners, not long after receiving its corporate charter. The company applied for a license to build a 16-inch oil pipeline from Edmonton to Regina, which would be the first segment of a system that would eventually travel as far as Montreal. But the main objective was to eventually connect Edmonton's oil production fields to the refinery centers in southern Ontario near Sarnia. The hearing took place in Ottawa at the Union Station building, and it lasted just one day. There were 12 people who appeared before the commissioners. So I've put up here on this slide the list of everybody who appeared to give you a sense of which interests were represented in these hearings. This was considerably different, as I've said, to the processes for pipeline construction and regulatory approvals today, which can take months, if not years, and involves many more interveners, including more members of the general public, as well as other interest groups outside of the company itself and the governments involved. All hearings before the Board of Transport Commissioners and applications for licenses to build pipelines had to be advertised ahead of time in local newspapers, but this didn't seem to elicit much, if any, public participation. Instead, the hearings were a relatively closed affair involving corporate executives, corporate lawyers, government representatives, government lawyers, and engineers. The fundamental objective of this pipeline is to obtain a wider market for the crude production of Alberta. This were the words of Oliver B. Hopkins, the first vice president of the Interprovincial Pipeline Company, in his testimony to the Board of Transport Commissioners in 1949. This was the central matter at hand and the driving force behind the initial development of what would become one of the largest oil pipeline systems in the world. To realize the full value of Imperial Oil's discoveries in Alberta, a pipeline would first need to be built to bring that oil to prospective markets. In Hopkins' view, Alberta's oil fields had a large surplus beyond the needs of the prairie region. He estimated that upwards of 40,000 barrels of oil per day of excess crude was available. According to Hopkins, the absence of a pipeline to deliver that crude to larger markets had led to a curtailment of crude oil production in Leduc. The proposed pipeline under consideration in 1949 was just the beginning, quote, the first leg of the journey, as Hopkins described it, to eventually reach larger markets beyond the prairies to supply further markets in Canada. Most of the discussion at this hearing was occupied with questions concerning the financing of the company and the line. Hopkins and his counsel presented statements from creditors and testified to the corporate structure of the Interprovincial Pipeline Company, which was a wholly owned subsidiary of Imperial Oil, in order to demonstrate that they had the available capital to successfully complete the project. the commissioners raised several questions about the availability of supply from Alberta. The chief commissioner, Justice Maynard Brown Archibald, for instance, asked Dr. Hopkins, "Are you satisfied that there will be available from the Alberta oil fields this amount of 40,000 barrels, whatever it is, put into your line at Edmonton?" Which I find this line of questioning really interesting because eventually this pipeline would be shipping over 1 million barrels of oil a day. And in their first hearing, they're questioning whether or not there would even be 40,000 barrels of surplus oil beyond the needs of the province of Alberta for shipping outside the province. He was particularly concerned about whether or not the province of Alberta would permit the oil to be shipped outside its borders. From that standpoint, replied J.W. Hamilton, counsel for Interprovincial, "It would look or seem to us that it would be in the interests of the province of Alberta to see that the crude or potential crude which is available can seek more distant markets and be competitive in those markets." While the board didn't ask any questions about property rights and the right-of-way, except for one or two questions about railway crossings, it did call the project engineer for Interprovincial, James Armstrong, to explain the route of the proposed pipeline and how that route was determined. Armstrong gave fascinating testimony that yields insight into the high modernist planning that went into the design of this mid-century oil pipeline. Which I think is worth quoting at length here. This is how Armstrong described the process by which the company determined the route of the pipeline. He said, "We eventually ended up with a route shown on this map through aerial studies and also actual expeditions by car. We drew this route out on a fairly large-scale map and had aerial photographs taken from which we got our aerial survey. From these mosaics that are produced by these aerial photographs, we laid out the line, missing everything that we could that would interfere with the installation of the pipeline. From there, from the mosaics, we then made tracings that were given to the land survey parties, and they in turn followed the route on these tracings and made any deviations and recorded any deviations from the line shown on the tracings for such things as ditches and houses that we couldn't see from the aerial survey maps. From there, after the ground survey was completed, our maps were then revised to show and record what the survey party had chosen. And then the maps were registered with the lands and title offices in both the provinces that we're considering." The only discussion of potential environmental impacts associated with the pipeline came from Fred Smith from the Department of Public Works, who attended the hearing as an observer to determine whether the Navigable Waters Protection Act would have any bearing on the matter of the interprovincial pipeline project. He noted that the pipeline would cross several streams and rivers along the proposed routes that, quote, "in wishing to put public lines underneath any of those streams, the company must, of course, make application to the Department of Public Works for permission to do so." The commissioners left the question of navigable waters then to the Department of Public Works and considered no further matters pertaining to environmental protection or public safety. Economic nationalist considerations influenced the assessment of early applications for licenses to construct oil pipelines. Interprovincial returned to the board just a few months later in September 1949 for approval of an extension beyond Regina to the Manitoba U.S. border near Gretna, which you can see on this map, which shows the sort of completion of the pipeline in 1950. The intent at the international border then would to link up to a pipeline in the United States that would then travel to Superior, Wisconsin, and be a transshipment point on the Great Lakes, where oil could then be shipped by tanker through the Great Lakes to Sarnia and reach the refineries and the markets of Southern Ontario. Commissioner Frank McPherson raised the matter of the route of the line crossing into the United States and inquired into the possibility of an alternative terminal at Port Arthur and Fort William. The lead engineer, again James Armstrong, confirmed that an all-Canadian route via Winnipeg to Port Arthur and Fort William involved terrain that would be too difficult to traverse and would render the project too expensive. He said the difficult terrain between Winnipeg and Port Arthur would increase the capital investment of the line to such an amount that it would be uneconomically feasible to construct the line. The route through the U.S. led to suspicions that Interprovincial intended to export oil to American refineries rather than refineries in Sarnia. Questions regarding the cross-border route of the Interprovincial extension were driven by local businesses and local governments in Port Arthur and Fort William. Business interests and local officials from the cities of Port Arthur and Fort William weren't satisfied with this cost-saving rationale. They sent formal telegrams expressing their protest of the proposed route, and the mayor of Port Arthur, as well as a senator representing the area, spoke in opposition to the construction of the pipeline on the grounds that it should run to a Canadian port for shipment to Sarnia. One such protest telegram from the Joint Industrial Board of the City Councils of Fort William and Port Arthur read, "We feel very strongly that if a subsidy were required to meet pipeline construction costs, every possible effort should be made to keep our Canadian resources and their transportation within Canada." Similar telegrams were also received from the Port Arthur and Fort William Trades and Labor Councils, the City Council of Fort William, the Chamber of Commerce of Port Arthur and Fort William, the Mayor of Fort William, and even local branches of the Canadian Legion in Port Arthur. The Port Arthur Chamber of Commerce insisted that communities along the pipeline will have great opportunities in the use of such oil for industry with the resulting benefits to our people, and we do not believe with diversion of the pipeline through the United States that this is good for the Canadian economy when all these factors are considered. The chief commissioner even allowed the mayor of Port Arthur to question the lead engineer from Interprovincial during the hearing, so he just turned over the questioning to the mayor of Port Arthur who showed up at the hearings. Ultimately, discussion and debate at these first two hearings for the Interprovincial pipeline focused mainly on economic issues, the cost of construction, the availability of sufficient reserves of oil for delivery, the availability of steel for the construction of the pipeline, the potential markets and refining centers, the cost-benefit analysis of alternative routes. The only objections came from local politicians and business interests in Port Arthur and Fort William who made economic nationalist arguments for a route that remained within Canadian borders and terminated in their cities rather than in Wisconsin. There was little to no discussion of safety, environmental risks, landowner rights, or the rights of any Indigenous nations whose territories would be bisected by the line extension. Over the course of a total of 3 days in 2 separate hearings, the Board of Transport Commissioners approved the construction of what would eventually become the largest oil pipeline system in Canada. Noting, quote, "The board is satisfied that the construction of the pipeline from Regina to Gretna on the route proposed will enable the applicant to get its oil to a market in the most economical and practical manner and with the least delay. And it should be pointed out that the time factor is of great importance in considering this application." So I'll turn now to the hearings that the board held a couple of years later for the Trans Mountain Pipeline Company in 1951, which show similar issues at play in the consideration of the application to build a second major long-distance oil pipeline from Alberta's crude oil production, this time from Edmonton to Burnaby. The route would travel through the Rocky Mountains at Yellowhead Pass near the Canadian National Railway line and then travel southward toward the Lower Mainland via Kamloops in the Coquihalla Valley, parallel to the Canadian Pacific Railway in the Fraser River Valley. Here again, the regulatory limits of the Board of Transport Commissioners were evident in the public hearings. The hearing covered many of the issues of concern that arose during the hearings for the Interprovincial pipeline. The board examined the route of the line, assessed the market potential in terms of oil production, refinery capacity, and consumer demand, and scrutinized the financing of the company. Environmental considerations were minimal. There was almost no discussion of landowner relations along the right-of-way, and Indigenous land rights, again, were absent. And there was no participation from parties outside of the applicant and the relevant provincial governments. Although minimal, environmental considerations weren't entirely absent from the hearings for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. More so with the Trans Mountain proposal than the Interprovincial proposal, the board posed questions and scrutinized the company about the environmental challenges of the proposed route of the pipeline. The board investigated the selected route of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, as it did with the Interprovincial, to determine the feasibility of its construction and whether it would follow an all-Canadian route, as well as what physical obstacles the company might face. Throughout its construction, environmental obstacles were a prominent concern for the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The company sought to build the line through some of the most mountainous terrain in Canada, which presented unique engineering problems that were raised during the hearing. In the hearing, the company asserted that these challenges weren't actually that substantial. Donald Roberts, the vice president of Canadian Bechtel Limited, the engineering company that Trans Mountain worked with in the design and engineering of the construction of the pipeline, surprisingly claimed that, quote, considering that the route traverses over 400 miles of mountainous terrain in the total length of 695 miles and crosses two main divides, it provides a remarkably easy location for construction and operation of an oil pipeline. His optimistic assessment was based largely on the fact that the pipeline would follow existing routes of the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railways, except for a 60-mile stretch from Kamloops to Merritt. This meant that there were existing roads and trails for access and telephone and telegraph lines for communication during construction and operation. He also referred to preliminary surveys of the route, which revealed that there was minimal solid rock that would require blasting on the route of the line. Most of the construction would involve standard equipment, he said. He described its preliminary survey work in determining the route of the proposed pipeline, work that included, again, both aerial surveys as well as field reconnaissance surveys. The company worked with Crown surveyors as well as other third-party experts who reviewed and verified their engineering planning for the route of the line. But in one brief line of questioning, counsel for the Board of Transport Commissioners raised some matters relevant to environmental hazards or risks associated with oil pipelines. H.E.B. Coyne, counsel for the board, questioned Roberts about safety measures and mitigation strategies to address the risk of oil spills on the proposed pipeline. He said, where you cross rivers or streams, if a leak developed, it might have rather serious consequences. Is that not so? He also sought information about any technological devices that could be used to guard against such leaks. Roberts noted that the company would be using heavier pipe than is required and that the line would be buried, quote, to a depth where surface disturbance will not bother it. He also noted that the pipe would be coated in asphalt or tar to guard against corrosion. He indicated that valves would be put in place to shut off the line in the event of a leak, but didn't see any reason for any special mitigation efforts near river or stream crossings, and testified, we do not feel that these sections present any exceptional hazard in the construction and operation of a pipeline over and above any other section of the line. Coyne pressed Roberts on this point, insisting that at river crossings, quote, the consequences might be more serious than others. The company planned to construct valves to shut off the flow of oil at regular intervals of 10 miles, but it didn't include any special measures at any of the 6 major river crossings of the pipeline, including the largest crossing at the Fraser River at Port Mann. So this was a really interesting interchange because within about a decade, the standards for the construction of oil pipelines would require companies to have shut-off valves on the opposite sides of a river crossing because a 10-mile interval would be, thousands of barrels of oil would still spill out before the line emptied after a valve was closed during a spill event. So the standards and practices would change not long after this pipeline was approved for its initial construction. Both the provincial governments in Alberta and British Columbia expressed strong support for the construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The Deputy Attorney General of Alberta provided a statement of support for the pipeline that outlined the key reasons why the pipeline would serve the interests of Alberta. The pipeline would provide a critical new outlet for oil production from his province. Again, this was the case with the interprovincial pipeline. The Trans Mountain Pipeline would link Alberta's oil production with growing markets on the Pacific coast, particularly in Vancouver. The pipeline would also catalyze further oil production to meet growing demand in these new Pacific Coast markets. And finally, he argued that, quote, "It is in the best interests of the national economy that the Pacific Coast area be supplied with oil produced in Canada." This economic nationalist remark was an allusion to some of the oil supply constraints that British Columbia had faced earlier in the 20th century. Trans Mountain's Vice President Sidney M. Blair also remarked on this in his testimony about the Pacific Coast of Canada, in which he said that the Pacific Coast had practically no oil production and was dependent upon seaborne deliveries of crude oil from crude and refined oil products from California. In the 1930s, disputes between oil producers in California and the British Columbia government had led to a temporary boycott of the province and a petroleum famine. And during the Second World War, the province once again faced supply constraints. In Blair's view, the market requirements of British Columbia and its urban center in the Lower Mainland were primed for growth and would be improved by a domestic oil supply from Alberta. The BC government was even more effusive in its support for the construction of a pipeline through the Rocky Mountains and eager to open up access to Alberta's oil production. The government presented a unanimous resolution passed by the provincial legislature in 1950 expressing support for the construction of an oil pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia's coast. The legislature saw several benefits to building this pipeline, including the belief that industrial development of the interior of British Columbia, as well as the Vancouver and Fraser Valley areas, would be greatly stimulated by the construction of oil and natural gas lines from Alberta and northeastern British Columbia through the interior of British Columbia to the Pacific Coast. The legislature reaffirmed this position in another resolution in 1951. In its statement to the Board of Transport Commissioners, the BC government expressed an economic nationalist perspective, indicating that, quote, "It is of great concern to the people of British Columbia that the line should be an all-Canadian route, that the terminus should be in the Greater Vancouver area in order to overcome difficulties encountered during the last World War, to ensure that the people of British Columbia shall enjoy to the fullest extent the benefits to be derived from the development of Canada's natural resources." In the view of the BC government, the advantage of the Trans Mountain proposal was the economic and industrial development in the province that would flourish from having access to reliable and plentiful supplies of cheap energy from Canadian sources. So, was it easier to get regulatory approval to build an oil pipeline in the late 1940s and early 1950s in Canada than it is today? Yes, obviously. Under the authority of the Board of Transport Commissioners, applying for a license to construct an oil pipeline was a much shorter process and involved less regulatory scrutiny. Companies didn't engage in formal consultations with affected communities, they didn't conduct environmental or social impact assessments, and they could expect public hearings to conclude in a relatively quick time frame. Those hearings were not devoid of opposition or challenge, though the formal resistance to the construction of these pipelines was limited, and hearings didn't include stakeholders beyond the immediate representatives from local governments, businesses, and the proponents themselves. These hearings weren't devoid of politics or conflict, nor were they entirely devoid of concern for some of the possible environmental effects of oil pipelines. However, those concerns were peripheral to the main areas of scrutiny, which tended to be economic in focus. I do want to emphasize, however, that resistance to oil pipeline development may have appeared minimal within the official channels of these hearings, but that doesn't mean that no resistance existed. Local opposition and concern have been continuous since the construction of the earliest long-distance oil pipelines in Canada. Opposition emerged at the local level among both settlers and Indigenous populations on the right-of-way. In Burnaby, in 1952, for example, local settler property owners petitioned their city council to get the route of the Trans Mountain pipeline changed out of concerns over damage it might cause to their yards and shade trees. And in 1953, in response to another extension of the interprovincial pipeline, the chief and council of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation from the Sarnia Indian Reserve wrote to the Minister of Transport objecting to the government's granting of a right-of-way through the reserve to the interprovincial pipeline company. The chief and council instead proposed an alternative route that would avoid the reserve because they were concerned that the pipeline would bisect the reserve and cut off the best land. They also feared future pipelines crossing their land. The cabinet, however, approved the right-of-way and ordered the company to compensate the First Nation in spite of the opposition. Pipeline hearings in the late 1940s and early 1950s then were a far cry from the pipeline politics and regulatory processes of the early decades of the 21st century. Both the politics and the processes have changed considerably, and I hope that this project will be able to trace some of those changes as the environmental and resource politics changed over the course of the period from the 1950s to the 1990s. Thank you.